Hello and welcome to Chapter 12 of our book, Investigating the Past Fossil Primates. This starts on page 311. We study the evolution of early primates to help put human evolution into context because we evolved from those early primates. So it gives us a context of where we evolved from. You can also study the Earth's history from the fossil record as well. Fossils are evidence of past life. They can either be a cast or an imprint, such as a fossil footprint or an imprint of a plant that's left behind, or they can be fossilization of a skeleton. Fossilization occurs when an animal dies and its body is covered by sediment, and under the right circumstances of temperature and pressure and time, the bone cells in that skeleton get replaced by minerals from the sediment. And it makes an exact copy, but instead of being bone, it's now made out of mineral. And so it requires just the exact right conditions for this to happen, which is why we have far fewer fossils than there are animals that have lived in prehistory, because it doesn't always, not every animal that dies becomes a fossil. So the people who investigate the past in this way are called paleontologists. And there's different types of paleontologists. So if you are studying primates, you're a paleoanthropologist. If you are studying other types of life, you are a paleozoologist. If you're studying prehistoric plants, then you're a paleobotanist. So it's different depending on what your area of focus is. And investigating the past is a very holistic practice. So you're not just doing it on your own, you're doing it in conjunction with other scientists who help to flesh out the entire story and picture that we're looking at. So many sources of evidence and many scientists helping out. There are three main categories of evidence that are studied. The first is the fossil itself. So the amount of information available from the fossil depends on what parts of the animal were preserved and how complete the fossil is and how good a condition it is. So if there is enough fossil to study, then we can learn a lot from it. And we're doing it by the same things that we talked about last week in chapter 11, which is looking at the form function complexes. So that form function link allows us to learn things about the animal depending on what parts we have available. So we can often discover evolutionary relationships by seeing what we have and comparing it to other fossils that we have found. If we have the teeth and the head, we can learn a lot about the diet through tooth morphology and cranial shape and cranial anatomy. We can learn roughly the age of the animal if based on tooth eruption, and if we've got long bones, whether the epiphyseal junctures are fused or not. We can learn something about the sex of the animal if it is a sexually dimorphic species. Remember, sexually dimorphic means the males and the females are different sizes, and their dentition, their canines are vastly different in size. So we can often learn something about whether we have a male or a female. We can also, if we're finding this sexual dimorphism within the primate, the fossil population, then we can say something about their mating behavior, because animals that are sexually dimorphic have a different mating pattern than animals that are not sexually dimorphic. So we can learn something about their mating systems. And if we have postcranial remains, then we can learn about their locomotor behavior based on that, again, that form to function link, whether, it'll teach us something about how they moved. The next category of evidence is the paleo environment. Okay, these animals don't exist in a vacuum. They lived in their environment. What was their environment like? And where they lived can tell you a lot about the animal. Did they live in a very wet environment, a very dry environment, a forested environment, more of a savanna, things like that. So the main aspects that we're trying to reconstruct about the environment are their proximity to water, what the vegetation present there was, and the climate. And we can learn a lot from the flora and fauna present in the area that our fossil was found, the fossilized flora and fauna, because many different species will give us actually a good indication of the environment and the climate and the habitat. For example, if we find alligator scales, it indicates there was a water source nearby, and it was probably a fairly wet environment. Alligators prefer to live more in a swampy area with a lot of free-flowing water, and so they wouldn't exist there if it was a desert or really dry, arid environment. We can also look at microscopic pollen grains, and that'll tell us what kind of plants were there, because plants have habitats too, just like animals do. Some plants thrive in a wetter environment. Some plants prefer a drier environment. Some prefer warmer. Some prefer cooler. So what plants were there at the same time as our fossil animal that we're looking at will give us an idea of what the habitat and environment looked like. So when we're trying to recreate the paleo environment that the animals lived in, it's very much a holistic science. We are talking about people, we are soil scientists, geologists, hydrology specialists to look at how the water patterns and the water flowed through the area, paleobotanists, paleozoologists, and if there's primate fossils, paleoanthropologists. And all those people work together to make a picture of the climate and the environment that these animals were living in. The third thing that we look at that we need to look at is called taphonomy. It's Taphonomy. Taphonomy is the study of the processes that are involved from the time the animal died until we dig up its fossil. Did the animal die and immediately get covered? And so we've got a pretty full, a pretty complete skeleton without too much damage to it. Was the animal exposed on the surface for an extended period of time before it became covered by sediment? In which case, sometimes the skeleton has gotten scattered and we won't get a complete skeleton. Sometimes the bones are weathered because they were out long enough for the flesh to be, removed by animals and insects in the environment, and then the bone can become weathered because of sunlight and just sitting out for too long. So all these things that occur, we need to take into account when we're looking at our fossil. And the clues we look at is, especially if we've got a partial skeleton, are the bones smooth and worn, which could indicate that the animal that got into a river and was tumbled. So if you think about river rocks and how smooth they are because they've been tumbling in the water, rubbing up against other rocks. Well, the same thing can happen to a skeleton before it settles. The skeleton might go tumbling down in a river for quite some distance before maybe it hits a bend in the river and becomes lodged into the sediment at that point and then covered, which would give us a smooth and worn bones. Are they cracked and split? That indicates that they were weathered on land before they became buried. How good a shape is the fossil? Is it a complete skeleton? Then it's probably something happened that it got buried right away. So if there's like a volcanic eruption and the animal dies maybe from the gases or from the ash itself and then becomes immediately covered by ash, we're going to get a complete or almost complete skeleton because it was immediately covered. You also get that if you've ever been to the La Brea tar pits in LA. Those animals got stuck in the tar and eventually died from dehydration or from starvation and kind of fell over in that tar and sunk into it. So they're going to have a complete skeleton that hasn't been tumbled, hasn't been weathered, hasn't been predated on. It's just going to be a pretty complete skeleton. Are there tooth marks on your bones? That can indicate that the animal was either killed by a predator, if they're large tooth marks, or that it was scavenged, if you have small tooth marks, such as rodent marks. As we get up to the point in time where we're looking at hominids that were using stone tools, then you can often find cut marks that would indicate that they were, if not killed by the hominids, at least they butchered them. They took some of the meat off, and their stone tools left cut marks. So that's all information that we can gather from this taphonomy, from learning about what can happen to it between death and the time we find it. A lot of this information, especially when it comes to tooth marks and cut marks and what they look like, comes from the field of experimental archaeology. So experimental archaeologists study archaeology, obviously, but they also want to learn how some of the tools that were made prehistorically might have been used. If they're tools, we don't have a living population that was seen using them, such as stone tools, so that they've actually learned how to recreate different types of stone tools and learned how they were made and how hard or easy they were to be made. And then taking those stone tools that they've made, they will then butcher a carcass and see what kind of cut marks get left behind and what do the cut marks look like, so that they know if they see it on a fossil that yes, that is a cut mark from a stone tool, or no, it's not. So when we're looking at fossils, we have to figure out where they exist in time. And that's looking at geological time. Now, there's a geological time scale that's hierarchical. So just like we did the hierarchy of, Animalia, Chordata, Vertebrata, Mammalia, there's also a time scale, a hierarchical time scale for time, where it's split up into eons, eras, periods, and epochs. So eons are the biggest and the epochs are the smaller. And the eons are split up just kind of arbitrarily by what type of animal is most populous on the planet at that time. So if you look on page 313 in your books, there is the geologic time scale. Not all of it, because it doesn't go back to the really far, far back before the Cambrian period, but from the Cambrian forward. So we have the eras are the biggest. We currently live in the Cenozoic era, and that's the Cenozoic era is the era that we are going to be studying in this class. We don't go back any far. The Cenozoic era is called the Age of Mammals. It's from 66 million years ago to the present, and it's when mammals arose. And that 66 million years is probably a pretty familiar number, because right around 66 million years ago is when that meteor hit and killed off all the dinosaurs. So the dinosaurs died off and the mammals arose, because there were mammals before the dinosaurs died off. There were mammals coexisting with dinosaurs, but they were very tiny, and you don't find very much in the way of fossils because they just were so small. They were like little mouse-sized things. Okay. So then we have the Mesozoic era that came before that. That's the age of reptiles. That's where we have the dinosaurs. It starts with the very small dinosaurs, and then they evolve into the very large forms like T-Rex and Apatosaurus and some of those bigger ones. And then before that was the age of fish, the Paleozoic era. But there's eras before that as well. They didn't show it in your book. So when we're starting with the Cenozoic era, then it has two periods, the Quaternary and the Tertiary. And the Quaternary is the Holocene and the Pleistocene. And those are the two we're going to talk about when we get to the next section of our class, where we're talking about the evolution of the human line. Okay, so but what we're going to talk about today is the tertiary period. This is the period where primates evolved from the common mammalian ancestor into all the different primates that we have today. So the tertiary period has 5 epochs that we're going to talk about: the Pliocene, the Miocene, the Oligocene, the Eocene, and the Paleocene. Okay, so we're going to talk about those in a little bit. That's, you know, the age that we're going to be talking about today. But how do we determine how old a fossil is when we find it? How do we determine which of those epochs it fits into? Well, the way that we do that is through two main categories of dating. The first one is the oldest one. It's the one that we first started using before science gave us methods to date better, and that is relative dating. So relative dating is, you can't say how many millions of years old something is. You can only say whether, if you've got two fossils, which is older and which is younger, and it's done through stratigraphy. So think about like a layer cake. When you make a layer cake, the bottom layer, and then the next layer and the next layer. So that lowest layer is the first layer that gets put down. You can't put the upper layer in first and have it floating in midair and then add the other layers below it. The lowest layer is the oldest, and then they get younger and younger as you go up. And that's true for geology as well. When sediment is laid down at the bottom of the ocean or the bottom of a lake, and if you take a core and you can see the different layers of sediment, the lowest one's going to be the oldest and the top one's going to be the youngest. So each strata in geology is the result of some natural geological event or process. So sometimes it's a volcano going off and putting down a layer of ash. Sometimes it's a flood that brings, a layer of sediment that covers a site. If it's an area that's been under the ocean, it's just the yearly, the stuff that falls down. It just builds up in layers. And then over time with pressure becomes from sediment to rock. And you can see that if you go to up like in the Oakland Berkeley Hills, where they've cut part of the hill open to make the streets like Skyline or Grizzly Peak, and you can see the layers, because the Oakland Berkeley Hills were not always hills. At one point, they were part of the ocean bed, the ocean floor. And so you can now go up there and you can see all the different layers of sediment that were laid down before the hills rose up over time through the geological processes. So this is termed the principle of superposition, the idea that the lower layers are going to be older and the higher layers are going to be younger. There can be geologic events that disrupt these clear layers, such as if there's continental drift and you have uplift. So the layers that were going like this are now going to be at an angle, forming hills or mountains. You can have, that's called folding, and you can have intrusions, and you can have faults. And that's why you involve a geologist when you're trying to do this type of dating, because they'll know the geology of that area if you hire a geologist that knows that area. So the relative age of the fossils is determined by what layer they're in. So if you have a fossil that's in this layer and a fossil that's in this layer, you can't say how many millions of years old they are, but you can say that this fossil is older than this fossil. Okay. Other relative dating techniques that have been used over the years are paleomagnetism, which is when you look at rocks, like when a volcano erupts, the rocks that are formed as the lava cools are going to have the magnetic, they're going to point to magnetic north for that period. And over geologic time, magnetic north has moved around. So you can look at the rocks that are around a fossil, and a geologist can look at which way their magnetism points and say, well, that was from around, this one points that way, so it's older than this one that points that way. There's also fluorine dating. There's also faunal correlation, which is saying that, if you look at your fossil primate and it's buried with some other fossil animals, and you can say that these animals with this fossil are older evolutionarily than the animals with that other fossil. So that other fossil has to be younger. If you have an idea of the animals that were found nearby or with your fossil primate. But those are all older. We don't really use them as much anymore because now we have what's called absolute or chronometric dating. And this is dating that's scientifically based and allows you to, again, not a pinpoint date, but a range of time for which this animal would have lived. It's commonly using radioactive isotopes. They don't do it based on the fossil itself. They're taking samples of the sediment around the fossil and studying it for the radioactive isotopes that are present. So when radioactive elements, when their atoms, they decay from a more unstable atom to a more stable atom over time. So when they look at this decay, it's on very standard how long it takes, depending on what what isotope you're looking at. So a common one that is used is potassium argon dating. So at the time that the rocks are laid down from volcanic activity or whatever, they only have potassium 40 atoms in them. But over time, the potassium 40 will decay to argon 40. So argon 40 is the daughter isotope of potassium 40. And this occurs at a measurable rate, which is called the half-life. The half-life is the time it takes for half of those potassium atoms to decay to argon atoms. And for the potassium argon dating, they take the half-life is 1.3 billion years. So there's a mathematical formula they can use to look at how many are there to give a date for when that fossil, when that animal passed away. That's the one that's most often used because the other one, uranium-238, has a much longer half-life. So it's used for much older fossils than primates. Then if we're looking at younger things such as, Neanderthals up through prehistoric natives to, up closer, we use radiocarbon dating, which is carbon-14 decaying to nitrogen. This is because this is only accurate to about 50,000 years ago. So you can't really use it for your older fossil populations. And the big difference between C14 dating and potassium argon or any of the other ones is with C14, it only works with organic material. So you actually are you're using it on skeletons that haven't completely fossilized, which is Neanderthals and younger. And you're taking a small sample from the actual bone and dating it and doing the same thing, looking at how much C14 there is versus how much nitrogen there is. And it'll give you an age range for that particular thing. The other way to date is with dendrochronology, which is tree ring dating. It is an absolute form of dating, mostly used archaeologically because you have to have basically you're looking at the trees that are there in their building, like if they use trees for making um, their ceilings and such. That's mostly where you find it is used in archaeological sites. So somebody has gone and researched the pattern of tree rings over time in that particular area. It only works if you're comparing. It's like you have to compare apples to apples. You have to look at the trees in that particular area that that site is located, so that the trees that the people use to build their houses would have come from that area and would have gone through the same climate as the trees that you'd use for making your tree ring data. Because remember, when trees grow, the ring sizes differ depending on whether it's a really wet year or a really dry year. If there was a fire or whatever, you can see it all in the tree ring pattern. And all the trees in the area, that they're going to have, during that time period, the same ring pattern. So you can do a timeline out of tree rings. So remember that absolute dating gives you a numerical age range, not an exact date, but a range. And relative dating only places fossils or geological events in sequence, which one's older, which one's younger, without any dates at all. Okay.